When we had last left off, we had just finished discussing Pharaoh's Curse, a Bel Air Productions film from 1957 released by United Artists. Though filmed first, Pharaoh's Curse was actually the second half of a double bill package with another horror film. The first film in that package, once again written by Richard H. Landau, would follow a very similar plot. White explorers venture into hostile lands and wage a losing battle against the forces of the unknown. Instead of early 20th century Egypt, our setting is the present-day South Pacific. Our story concerns a fact-finding mission led by Philip Knight, played by Boris Karloff, a famous author and debunker of occult hoaxes. A surveyor from a four-man team hired by a hotel magnate is the only one to return alive from scouting a remote Polynesian island, and in a seeming zombie trance to boot. Knight is the one tasked with figuring out what happened to them. Of course, he has no interest in conducting an objective investigation, only in getting a juicy story for his next book. And, of course, he and his expedition party run afoul of voodoo chicanery. Hence the title, Voodoo Island. Much like Pharaoh's Curse, Voodoo Island is an example of exploitation filmmaking from the late 50s that signals the decline of sci-fi monsters and aliens, and a return to the gothic horror that dominated America's pre-war cinema, albeit with a more graphic spin. Unlike Pharaoh's Curse, however, Voodoo Island sits in a tradition of horror and adventure fiction that has progressively lost its salience for contemporary audiences. Not like mummies have proved to be particularly popular or salient monsters in their own right, but there's still at least some kind of legibility to simply the image of a dried-out husk in tattered rags. It's at least easier to disaggregate those kinds of Egyptian ghouls from outdated conventions, especially those regarding how European countries and the colonized Americas tended to view the land of the pharaohs and the people occupying it. Heck, it probably helps that your average mummy movie seems to suggest, at least nominally, that it is generally not smart for white folks to just go stumbling around where they're not wanted, violating graves and stealing artifacts and whatnot. The same can't really be said for what I'd call the jungle horror film, a nebulous genre to which Voodoo Island neatly belongs. Historically, jungle horror combines elements of conventional adventure stories and the occasional bit of fantasy or scientific romanticism with gothic horror. Common components include, as you might expect, a jungle setting, as well as long, perilous journeys through tropics, along wide, winding rivers, and through vine-strewn forests or both, impulsive career explorers staking hunting rare game or attempting to reach the darkest interiors of the uncharted continents for whom pride is the greatest fortune, or perhaps a two-fisted anti-hero with a dark past, a cynical exterior and a penchant for drink, but a heart of gold, the new bourgeois woman eager to see the world and her obverse in the neglected wife or frigid damsel in the making just along for the ride, colonial chateaus typically situated on plantations where corpulent gentlemen sweat through their khakis and just try to keep the mosquitoes at bay, natives who run the gambit from silent and servile to po-faced comic relief, especially if they are children, to macabre savages, and finally, particular to the cinema, lots and lots of stock footage of exotic animals. I hope my decision to end on a joke about stock footage didn't distract my dear listener from the ultimate point I was leading up to, because there really is one simple and direct reason why this type of movie is so rare to the point of being virtually non-existent nowadays, whereas there are still attempts at blockbuster mummy movies. In our previous episode on Pharaoh's Curse, I made the claim that, to a certain extent, all movies made within a white supremacist society are programmatically racist. In the case of horror movies, whether you're talking about the Romanian Dracula, Frankenstein's hunchback servant, the chimpanzee-like representation of Mr. Hyde, or the Egyptian mummy, many of the stock monsters and ghouls we now universally recognize today were steeped in contemporary racial phobias. But with certain kinds of monsters, the connections between their representation and their undergirding racist tropes is sufficiently abstract that we either no longer recognize them, or they have been repurposed and renegotiated so many times that their historic roots are no longer legible. At the end of the day, a vampire or a werewolf or a mummy is just an assemblage of motifs that we associate with predators and death. There's nothing essential or intrinsic that's binding them to a fear of a specific type of other. Sometimes, as in the case of vampires, the actual other that the monster represents can be almost completely inverted from its conventional understanding. I mean, come on, when was the last time you saw a vampire movie in which they were presented as foreigners trying to rape our women? Aren't they, more often, invocations of wealthy, cosmopolitan elites whose identification is with the most vampiric aspects of our own homegrown values? The same can't really be said for the jungle horror film. There are very rarely undead monsters or demons or changelings in these types of movies. In fact, in some of them, to the extent that there is a supernatural element to the narrative, there is a tendency to represent these phenomena as having a rational explanation. Magic is just another word for illusion. By extension, monster are just descriptors of animals and people. From a narrative perspective rooted in colonial white supremacy, the capacity to assert a rational viewpoint is both a virtue and a tool of the colonizer. The fault in perception, the lack of inquisitiveness, the natural inclination to being controlled, invariably falls upon the colonized. By the same token, however, since monstrosity is in fact only an irrational, mystifying representation of natural animal phenomena, it also invariably proves to be the case that the colonized are themselves represented as inferior animals, as monsters. In the classic jungle horror film, if there must be a monster, it is either a black or brown man, or a white person who has become tainted by their association with them. In place of more malleable, abstract signifiers of the predator and of the dead, what we perceive is a naked fear of black and brown people, of the ornamental African body and flesh itself connoting inherent fear and revulsion on the part of white spectators. And despite a mitigating rationalist outlook, the animal savagery associated with naked black and brown flesh invariably becomes conflated with something mystical, essential, transmutable, even infectious. A full understanding of Voodoo Island as a kind of revival, and even a certain revision of the classic Gothic horror film, necessarily involves taking an uncomfortable look at a cycle of films, the jungle horror movie, that was, in fact, one of the most popular and consistently exploitable types of American cinema from the 30s through the 40s. The legacy of this cycle of films is still with us. It's just that, in the absence of the most overt and dehumanizing kinds of representation of blackness as literal animal monstrosity, elements of the jungle horror have found even more clandestine echoes in popular consciousness. It's obviously difficult to pin down a precise route to modern cinema that combined adventure with Gothic horror. I mean, where does one begin? Perhaps with H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1896, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, first serialized in 1899, maybe Richard Connell's The Most Dangerous Game from 1924. I think our best bet is to look first to the stage, and then to the pages of literary nonfiction. In 1926, Chester DeVond and Kilbourne Gordon's Congo premiered on Broadway. The story of an invalid magician who plots revenge on the man who cuckolded and crippled him from an outpost deep in the interior of Tanzania, it was adapted to the screen twice. First in silent form as West of Zanzibar in 1928 and starring Lon Chaney in the magician role, and then again as a talkie in 1932. Of particular note is the silent adaptation, directed by none other than Todd Browning, one of the earliest auteurs of the American Gothic horror film, having previously directed Lon Chaney in The Unholy Three, The Unknown, and London After Midnight, and later to helm Universal's Dracula in the sound era, as well as MGM's Freaks in 1932, considered by many to be his masterpiece. A major conceit of the film is that the magician, Pharaoh, uses his magic tricks in order to beguile the gullible natives, bending them to his will and making them his personal army. This detail is clearly inspired by the ivory trader Kurtz from Conrad's novel, and what's more, it also seems that Chaney's physical appearance in the film, his scalp shaved down to a sweaty stubble, may have directly inspired Marlon Brando's own shaved head in Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. Though the Gothic monstrosity of the film radiates from a white man, clearly invoking the same thin line drawn between so-called civilization and savagery derived from Heart of Darkness, just as with Conrad, Browning makes deliberate use of blackness to unsettle the audience, as well as to represent the darkness of Frosso's soul. As for the tribesmen, frequently festooned in elaborate ritual garb that covers their whole bodies, their faces hidden behind skull masks, these characters are, of course, given very little in the way of being characters. From the very beginning of motion picture technology, being an invention of European and colonial industrial societies, standards determined to achieve a neutral, lifelike representation of a human subject presumed the tones of Western Europeans. A photograph is, after all, only an image produced by light reflected through a lens that reacts chemically with the emulsion of a film frame. Human skin has the same kind of properties as all other matter when exposed to light. The lighter a subject is, the more light is being reflected off of it. The darker, the more is being absorbed. Achieving a neutral and balanced photograph, thus, requires determining, typically through what is called a light meter, how much light you should expose your film to and for how long, so that the focal content of your image will be somewhere between whitest light and purest black. But, of course, so-called white skin is not, in fact, a neutral or balanced skin tone. The skin tones of Europeans, particularly Western and Northern Europeans, represent only one extreme of the natural pigment found in human skin. It is not the neutral point between extremes. The neutral level of pigment would indeed be much, much darker than, say, Lillian Gish. Nonetheless, the standardization of light theory in modern photography, how much light to expose and for how long to create a neutral, lifelike image, developed in a context where those innovating and capitalizing on this technology did not merely not know any better, but were steeped in cultural contexts in which light, fair skin was culturally fetishized. Thus, it was once the standard convention of early cinema to actually cake actors in light makeup so that they would reflect even more light back into the camera lens. On the other hand, because the presumptive neutral image was always quite light, and because light skin is not a neutral tone, this had the tendency of making dark-skinned performers, when they did appear even darker than they actually were. Paradigms of whiteness were so deeply interwoven into the development of film technology and filmmaking, from lighting to cinematography to makeup, that for decades there really wasn't any school on how to depict dark skin itself as natural and lifelike. It was really only with the innovations of filmmakers of color, both in the United States and abroad, that we finally saw techniques emerging for creatively making up, lighting, and filming dark-skinned subjects in a manner that neither exaggerated nor disguised their natural skin color. But even to this day, there remains a tremendous amount of ignorance in both technical academia and the film industry among white technicians in particular, about the unique challenges of capturing a natural, lifelike image of dark-skinned performers, or how to incorporate them into a still disproportionately white performer base. And in case you're saying to yourself, well, surely with digital technology, with photo film being replaced by light-sensitive sensors, surely our more globalized, progressive, and innovative technicians and capitalists of today have not made the same mistakes, and have created a more accurate and precise means of capturing skin color. To that I would say, boy, do I have a bridge I'd like to sell you. West of Zanzibar makes extensive use of chiaroscuro lighting. In other words, the film is shot in such a way that there are even harsher contrasts than normal between the lightest and darkest parts of the image. As a consequence, the film's dark-skinned performers, more likely to be shot against shadows, against the backdrop of tropical night, appear even darker. More than the white performers, the black performers of the film are treated as an ornamental mass, aesthetic objects that are associated with and represent a spiritual darkness. At once, this highly aestheticized representation of the black performers segregates them even further in the perception of whites from the natural, so much so is the emphasis on the unnatural portrayal of them. The obverse of this is also, however, the oppressive naturalism with which they are conceived, so much a part of the jungle environment that they become one with the darkness. This duality between the natural and the unnatural in the eyes of the white spectator turns them into vivid Gothic subjects, the film's most explicit evocation of the monstrous. Obviously, West of Zanzibar was far from the first film, whether using dark-skinned performers or light-skinned performers in exaggerated dark makeup, to exploit some variation of this contrast between light and dark in the human skin. But it is likely the most significant example when considered in the history of film horror, in fully conceiving of dark skin itself as not merely what is not white, but more so that which is romantically monstrous and horrific. This process is not only aesthetic, however. It is deeply embedded in the narrative structure of the film itself. As part of his revenge plot, Froso kidnaps Maisie, the daughter of the man who cuckolded and crippled him, and submits her to physical and psychological torture. In one scene, she witnesses a ritual in which the natives kill a woman by throwing her on the funeral pyre of her dead father. The culmination of Froso's plot is to have the natives kill Maisie herself by burning her alive, and the twist is that Maisie is, in fact, his own daughter. Metaphorically, Froso has become so consumed by his lust for revenge, the dark and savage impulse, that he has been rendered no different than the natives who he believes he controls. Quite the contrary, it is the darkness that governs him, and not the other way around. Thus, even on a narrative level, blackness figures in the film only as an expression of neurotic white fantasies. Rather than people, the African other is conceived of only as a projection of the intemperate desires and primitive drives that the modern civilized white hates within himself. Integral to the ornamentation of black bodies in west of Zanzibar, and perhaps even more influential than the monstrous portrayal of blackness itself, is the use of elaborate ritual to characterize the frenzied, lustful, and bloodthirsty nature of primitive man. In particular, allusions to voodoo. Now, technically speaking, when spelled with a capital V, voodoo, meaning spirit, is the word ascribed to the religious beliefs and rituals of the Fon, an ethnic and linguistic group originating in West Africa. It is also ascribed to and adopted by a series of diasporic spiritual movements carried by enslaved West Africans to the colonized Americas, particularly notable in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Louisiana. In these cases, voodoo develops as a synthesis of traditional African and European Christian beliefs, rituals, and iconography. Of course, that is with a capital V. With a lowercase v, voodoo in the American vernacular might as well be synonymous with precisely what west of Zanzibar depicts. Hooting, rhythmic frenzy practiced by primitive blacks in sensational garb, with a particular emphasis on violence and sacrifice as a spectacular centerpiece. And while this is not to say that part of the appeal of these sorts of portrayals of non-whites and their customs was never legitimate anthropological interest, clearly, whether we're looking at works of documentary or the lowest rungs of independent exploitation, these films were always to some extent pitched to audiences on at least the pretense of their ethnographic authenticity, on giving white spectators an unalloyed look behind the veil of time and space to places that they had never been. But all context being flattened, all lingering references to authentic beliefs, practices, and craft being cannibalized by sensation, voodoo in the jungle horror film proved to be a consistently reliable and malleable signifier of the foreign, the primitive, and the corrupt, even when the jungle horror film itself was not set in Africa or amid the African diaspora, even when blacks themselves were neither the primary nor the predominant bodies ornamented by it. Interest in voodoo greatly increased with the publication of William Bueller Seabrook's The Magic Island in 1929. Detailing Seabrook's experiences investigating Haitian voodoo, the highly sensationalist travelogue and memoir was a great success, and also most white audiences' first access to detailed accounts of voodoo beliefs and rituals. Seabrook alleging that, with the help of a voodoo mambo or priestess named Maman Zélie, that he had been directly initiated into them as a participant as well as an observer. Haiti almost immediately became the most popular setting for the jungle horror film. Columbia Pictures' Black Moon, a 1934 film based on a short story by Clements Ripley, starred Fay Wray as a white Haitian émigré who fled the country after her parents were murdered in a voodoo ritual, only to return as an adult to be venerated as the goddess of the same voodoo cult. A pretty clear takeoff and inversion of the premise of Congo. Actually shot in Kingston, Jamaica, the SAC Amusements distributed race film The Devil's Daughter from 1939 focused on a girl from Harlem who inherits a banana plantation and faces opposition from her disinherited half-sister, who is herself a voodoo priestess. The independently produced 1936 film Ouanga, shot in Haiti and Jamaica, similarly featured a black female plantation owner who uses a voodoo curse in order to exact revenge on a white male neighbor who rebuffs her romantic advances in favor of a white woman. The Magic Island also probably did more than any other book to popularize what is now one of the most prolific words in the horror lexicon: zombie. The term zombie is most likely derived from a generic Congolese word for spirit, and its use in Haitian folklore to describe dead persons physically revived through witchcraft to be used as slaves reflects upon the soul dualism essential to Haitian voodoo. As opposed to the conception of the soul as being an incorporeal essence distinct from the body practiced by most secular monotheistic religions, in voodoo, each person has two souls in one soul corresponding to the flesh and one soul corresponding to the spirit. A zombie is, therefore, the product of a person who, after dying, has had the unity of their two souls severed, usually through witchcraft, preventing them from achieving peace after death. There are not only corporeal zombies in Haitian voodoo, but also astral zombies, spirits without bodies that can be captured by witches in bottles or gourds and sold as fetishes. Obviously, however, it is the corporeal zombie that has proved to be of the most interest to Western popular culture, where the concept was synthesized with extant European folklore of the undead and romanticist themes. The voodoo exploitation cycle very quickly evolved into a zombie exploitation cycle, beginning in earnest with Victor Halperin's cult favorite White Zombie in 1932, followed by a pseudo-sequel Revolt of the Zombies in 1936, the unrelated King of the Zombies, Revenge of the Zombies, and Voodoo Man from Monogram Pictures in 1941, 1943, and 1944 respectively, and culminating in RKO Radio Pictures' Zombies on Broadway in 1945, which served in part as a parody of the zombie cycle up to that point. All of these films effectively center on the concept of a single affluent figure, usually a white male, that appropriates voodoo in order to create zombies to act as his ghoulish servants. Besides the use of the terms voodoo and zombie, these films do not reflect any earnest interest in voodoo religion or rituals. They are, rather, attempts to conform pre-existing and popular mad scientist and Svengali villains to a topical fad of popular awareness. And as the title White Zombie pretends, the primary interest of these films was in suggesting the novelty of the use of archaic black magic being used against white people. Effectively, whatever terror these films could elicit stemmed first from the jungle horror trope of primitive blackness merely standing in representation of the inherent darkness of even civilized men's souls. The rare outlier among the Depression and Second World War era zombie movies in terms of its reflecting an authentic and relatively well-researched interest in voodoo was Val Lewton's I Walked with a Zombie from 1943. Rather subversively, Lewton's film never portrays voodoo itself as a bad thing. The terror that the frenzied black and brown bodies inspire in the spectator, their courtship of death, and the violence of their rituals, is a matter of perspective and of cultural values. The narrative of the film itself is, however, a Gothic tragedy of unrequited love and repression, in which the persistent lack experienced by the white characters is contrasted with the more expressive and communal mythology of voodoo, and in which voodoo itself can be subversively read as liberating two of its characters from their repression, even if the cost of that liberation is that they fully embrace death. The White Zombie of Lewton's film is not a product of voodoo, but of heartbreak. The zombified bodies, the ones bereft of spirit and unmoored from connection to anything outside of themselves, are the ones possessed by the white characters. Voodoo, in contrast, is presented as a liberating theology because it embraces death. The Haitian zombie is pretty evidently a product of the small island nation's unique history of colonialism and slavery. At the time Seabrook was researching his book, Haiti was undergoing the tail end of a U.S. military occupation that had begun all the way back in 1915. This occupation sought to entrench favorable political and economic relationships between the country's elites and American financial interests, and as such, there was significant opposition to U.S. presence in the country, largely concentrated among its agrarian and subsistence poor. Historically speaking, Voodoo evolved literally as a means of West African enslaved peoples to preserve their sense of cultural and spiritual national identity and resist full conversion under first Spanish and then French colonization and enslavement. As a result, Voodoo also became a historically key mechanism for the most marginalized of Haiti's people to rally around a common mythology of resistance. The Haitian zombie itself can be viewed, in part, as a nightmarish representation of the slave, a body without a spirit, the soul and the flesh trapped in servitude, cleaved from its sense of belonging to something outside of itself. Not only were American films exploiting voodoo as Gothic horror unable to avoid the clear relationship between zombies and slavery, in some instances, whether they took place in castles in Haiti or on plantations in Louisiana, they actively courted the association. This association was, however, mitigated by the generic fantasy of being controlled and corrupted by forces associated not with civilization, but with blackness and barbarism. The zombie itself would slowly evolve into its own distinct pop culture phenomenon, maintaining the colonial perception of this creature being a specifically primitive and savage form of the undead, informed by a fear of blackness and black magic, but increasingly mitigated by synthesis with European and colonial literary motifs to the point that its roots in racist fantasy are almost completely illegible. The modern zombie is more a product of the American preoccupation with its own potential destruction at its own hands, the inevitable violent entropy of empire as modernity increasingly strips people of their personhood and alienates them from one another, or as consumer decadence leads to our self-cannibalization. People forget that George A. Romero, the godfather of the modern zombie movie, did not even originally refer to his creatures as zombies, but as ghouls, which is probably a more accurate descriptor for these new, rotting hordes of the cinema, the influence for which is far more obvious in the avenging undead of Frankenstein, H.P. Lovecraft's Herbert West Reanimator, and the lesser-known 1943 Universal film The Mad Ghoul, involving Mayan rather than voodoo occult magic. The increasing preoccupation of the modern, non-voodoo zombie movie is with graphic violence and implied vengeance or divine justice for perceived transgressions against nature and against God. As for voodoo, rather than capital V, this lowercase theme was so ephemeral that with successive decades it would be almost completely cleaved from even the definition of zombie entirely. Even by the point of Halperin's Revolt of the Zombies, both terms were so generic that enterprising filmmakers could confidently apply them to a film set in, say, Cambodia. Voodoo in one sense, zombie in another, these terms in popular culture, by the time that Bel Air released Voodoo Island in 1957, had become pure anachronisms.